Hey, Genderqueer chat. It's Stacy. It's Tuesday, and I don't think we have a topic this week. So, I am going to cover last week's topic this week, since I missed last week, which I was actually traveling last week, which is why I missed the topic. I went to Ohio, which doesn't sound exciting to a lot of people, I'm sure, but I rather like going to Ohio. It was a very short trip. I was only gone really 3 days, and it was for work, so it really wasn't, I didn't do a lot of sightseeing or anything like that, but, I kind of like Ohio. I like it. I went twice last year, and this was my first time going this year, but, yeah, it's a nice state, and everyone's very friendly, and it has a very homey sort of feel to it. I could see why people live there. Would I pack up and move? Probably not, but if my work transferred me there, I wouldn't think it was the end of the world. So yeah, it was a very rushed trip. I enjoyed myself, but it was very, very quick. There was something on my agenda from the second my plane touched down to the second I took off to go back home. So yeah, I was very tired, and I kind of caught up on sleep this weekend, sort of, and I just caught up on genderqueer chat videos today. So I just heard the topic, I just found out what topic was covered last week, and I just finished watching all the videos, and I didn't give myself too much time to think about this topic. As challenging as it is, I'm just going to try to take a stab at it, and not overthink it too much. So many props, by the way, to everyone who answered last week. Again, it's a pretty challenging topic to cover. So the topic last week was, how would you present gender to 9th graders? Or how would you explain gender to 14, 15-year-olds, basically? So I have an outline with me because, I'm afraid I'm going to forget something. So I literally made an outline, bullet pointing everything I would discuss. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I'm not actually going to try to explain it, but I'm just going to kind of give you an idea of what I would discuss, how, and in what order I would discuss that in, and why. So, I followed a very similar outline. I think my mom sort of outlined the sex talk when I was younger. She didn't just jump in, as many people did, I'm sure. She didn't jump in and say, okay, here's how babies are made. She didn't do that. She gave a foundation first. And I kind of followed that outline, sort of, with explaining gender. So, again, you don't just jump into the sex talk. That's another tough talk to have. I think gender is another tough talk to have with a group of kids. So the sex talk, you just don't jump into the middle of it. You start somewhere. You start with, maybe the differences between boys and girls, the physical differences. And then maybe you move on to puberty and what changes are going to happen to your body, when, why, things like that. And then finally you move on to reproduction, right? So I kind of did the same thing with gender. I sort of layered the discussion I would have so that things make sense, and hopefully things would fall into place for that young person. So, and I do think, before I get started on this, I do think that the sex talk, as well as sexual orientation and gender, should be all taught in school. I really, really think that it should be, and that's awesome that Joe is able to have this workshop. I think that's amazing. I really do. Yeah, I think all three of those topics should be taught in school at some point, because they're very important, and I think the only thing that's really discussed here in the United States is the sex talk or reproduction. Everything else, sexual orientation, last I knew, that was not covered in school. I know gender is definitely not covered in school. So I think all of those things should be basically a mandatory part of the curriculum at some point. So, starting with, to start my discussion on gender, I would recap sex, and not necessarily reproduction, but assigned sex. So when you come out of the womb, you are either born with a vagina or a penis, right? And depending on whichever one you have, you're either assigned the male or female labels at birth. So I would recap that and recap male body parts versus female body parts, and the fact that gender is assigned at birth due to whichever body part you have. However, that's not always correct. Then I would move on to sexual orientation. And the reason why I would start with sex, by the way, assigned sex, is because that's something everybody can relate to. Everybody has one or the other body part in that classroom. So, so that's why I would start with that, because I think it creates a common foundation, a common ground to jump off from. So sexual orientation, I would move on to that next and discuss that what sexual orientation is, gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, etc. And just because who you like or who you're attracted to or who you love, that does not have any sort of play into gender. That's something completely separate. I would discuss that next and make sure that there was a clear understanding that sexual orientation, assigned sex, and gender are three completely different things, just to eliminate any confusion from the very beginning. Then I would go on to gender, and not assigned gender, but actual gender. And I would talk about cisgender or the gender binary, male, female. And I would talk about the gender boxes there, and I would also let the kids know that, there are more than two options. A lot of people don't know that, but there are more than two options. You don't need to pick just one or the other. So I would then go and move the topic to transgender individuals and talk about transgender and how people who are transgender don't always feel that they fit into the body that they're in. Sometimes they may feel stuck in that body, and sometimes they will go through surgery or take testosterone or estrogen to make their body match the way they feel. So if they feel female on the outside but they have a male body, they will sometimes take the steps to make their body female so it reflects who they are, and vice versa. So I would talk about transgender next, and the reason why I'll talk about transgender next is so there wouldn't be any confusion between between transgender and genderqueer individuals. So after I discussed the gender binary and people who feel that they fit into the gender binary, that they are comfortable in the gender binary, then I would move to transgender, to people who are still usually within the gender binary but sometimes don't feel that they fit in the body that they have been put in. And then I'd move on to genderqueer individuals, which are people who are not in the gender binary, who are not transgender, but who feel that they are either outside of gender completely, or they feel that they are a different gender, or maybe they feel that they are both genders, or any sort of variation of that, gender fluid. I would discuss all of those different terms and terms that are under that, as many have said earlier in earlier videos, the umbrella term of genderqueer, and how there's really no right or wrong answer for gender. I mean, gender's kind of, you can, it's your own to create. It's an expression of who you are, and there can be as many different genders as there are people. And I know someone on the channel said that in the past. I'm not sure who, but Yeah, and I think that's wonderful, a wonderful thing to point out, especially to kids, that there's no right or wrong answer to gender, you know. Um, yeah, so even if they don't feel that they fit into a certain gender box, or one of the gender queer terms don't fit them, that's okay. You know, that's still, they're still free to be who they are. And I think that's very important to stress to kids, especially at that age, because they're so concerned with, you know, social pressures and family pressures and fitting in, maybe some things, maybe some religious pressures as well. So it's a very confusing time for those kids. So I think it's very important to stress that they can be who they are and express that however they see fit, and that's okay. So, of course, I would spend the majority of the time talking about gender, but then after that whole section would be over, I would move on to society and how society views gender, and you know, things from like gendered items like um, male clothes versus female clothes, or you know, maybe even names, because we did discuss names on this channel. I think that would be an interesting point to bring up. You know, things that don't have a gender necessarily, but things that society, we place gender on. No, I'm not saying this right. Things that don't have a gender, but we assign gender to those things. So I would move to that next, and maybe hopefully smashing some views of gender in the meantime. And then of course I would move on to respect and social interactions with people who are differently gendered, and because I think, as several people said, that is important to discuss, especially with kids that age. And then I think finally I would end with a Q&A with a genderqueer person. So if the person facilitating the discussion wasn't genderqueer themselves, I would either want a genderqueer person present during that whole, you know, this is also assuming that I'm not giving this presentation. I would want a genderqueer person present through that discussion, or maybe have a genderqueer person come in at the end for just some open discussion, Q&A sort of things, anything that wasn't covered necessarily in that, in the, I guess, gender workshop session, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, so I think that would be very important, just have an open dialogue, Q&A type of thing, something very relaxed at the end to give the kids maybe a sense of closure with the topic, any answers to any outline questions, maybe find resources, or yeah, or just have a relaxed discussion or a positive interaction with someone who identifies as genderqueer, I think would be, or differently gendered, or what have you. I think that would be a very good way to end that. Of course, throughout the whole thing, I would think that interaction would be key. You know, kids are lectured to constantly. I think that it would, I think that having that sort of interaction or some sort of game or something to keep them engaged and to keep it fun and to keep it informal would be best to really get the point across, you know, because you don't, you know, if you lecture at a kid, it goes in one ear and out the other, you know. But if you engage them in some way, whether that be through the gender Gumby, as people had mentioned earlier, or the genderbread person, which is also a really great model, or some other type of game or something, I think that would be easiest to keep their attention and to keep the whole workshop flowing. So anyway, that is my outline, I guess, for that. That's how I would handle that discussion, I guess. And yeah, I will talk to you guys next week. Bye.